Hi, I'm Nick Pearce and I'm the Managing Director of Melbourne-based video game studio Modern Storyteller. And for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about the 10 lessons I learned turning my mod into a standalone game, The Forgotten City. So, why listen to me? Well, I'm the lead developer of The Forgotten City. It is a critically acclaimed narrative-driven time loop adventure in ancient Rome. It was released several weeks ago and it has a Metacritic score of 85. It's ranked 16th best game of 2021 out of many thousands of games. It has an overwhelmingly positive Steam user score, which is the holy grail for devs, and it also scored a 9 out of 10 from Game Informer and IGN and GameSpot. A little bit about my journey. Jumping back in time to 2015, I released a mod called The Forgotten City, which racked up 3.7 million downloads and was the first mod in history to win a National Writers Guild Award. And here is me looking just as surprised as everybody else at the award ceremony, because a mod had never done that before. And so I decided to reimagine The Forgotten City as a standalone game, but I just had 3 small problems. And they were 1, I had no time, 2, I had no budget, and 3, I had absolutely no idea how to make a standalone game. And so over the next 4.5 years, I solved all of those problems by 1, quitting my job and founding a studio, 2, securing funding from Film Victoria a few times actually, and Epic Games and publisher Dear Villagers, and finally I built a team of awesome people with deep specialised knowledge. I want to give you a foreword about risk and reward because there's no sugarcoating it. Game development is a risky business. To get started, I had to quit my job, meaning I had to walk away from an established 10-year legal career and forego several years' worth of wages. So I had a pretty significant opportunity cost. And I also had to invest about 100 grand of my own cash. When I took the leap, it was probably the most insanely risky thing I'd ever done. But I loved game dev. My experience modding, was really wonderful, and I wanted to do that professionally. And little did I know, on the journey, I discovered that it was actually even riskier than I thought, because there were several points along the way where the project very nearly became dead in the water. I was having to apply for grants and deals and so forth, and if I hadn't got some of them, we probably would not have been able to finish the game. So in some ways, it's a miracle that the game was completed. Despite that, taking that leap was probably the most rewarding experience of my life so far, and I'm very happy that I did it. But your mileage may vary. And with that in mind, the next 10 steps, the next 10 lessons are about giving you the information that I wish I had when I started, and making sure that you minimize your risks and maximize your potential rewards. So, number 1, keep your team lean. We made our game with a core team of 3 people with help from a handful of short-term contractors, and that worked really well. So the way we divided our responsibilities was I was the producer, director, writer, and designer. Alex Goss was our programmer. John Eyre was our 3D artist. And we found that worked well, with the main problem being that I was working very long hours because I was wearing a lot of hats. And so if I had a do-over, I would probably hire a full-time producer to share the burden of all the administrative tasks, as well as a part-time animator to help with the things that we struggled with a bit ourselves. I see a lot of indie teams making games with really large teams, or at least teams which are much bigger than ours, and to me that seems like a recipe for running out of runway really quickly, or being forced to underpay your staff, which is possibly worse. So I would encourage people to try to do more with the core team, or just hire specialists for sort of bit piece roles rather than trying to build a really big team. One of the traps that I think people can fall into is that having more people doesn't necessarily mean you'll make faster progress. I know it seems like it would, but it doesn't, because essentially the more people you have to manage, the more people you bring on board, the less of your own work you can get done. And so, for example, if one programmer can complete 100 tasks a week, 2 programmers might complete 160 tasks a week, because the lead programmer has to be constantly managing and monitoring the other. And they need to communicate and coordinate, and the bigger the team, the more time you spend communicating and coordinating. So you get diminishing returns from each additional person you add to the team. That's been our experience anyway. And so one of the ways that I would suggest making progress faster, instead of building a big team, is to reduce scope and to take shortcuts. So for example, one of the shortcuts we used was that we used a piece of software called Character Creator 3 to model and automatically rig all of our player characters, all of our NPCs. And it cost next to nothing, because it's a very, very inexpensive piece of software. And it's quite similar to MetaHuman, which you might have seen advertised. It's an extraordinary looking piece of software used for generating awesome characters in Unreal Engine 5, and I think it's going to be massive and probably set a new standard for character creation. We also used lots of marketplace content for prototyping, which made us made that process very quickly, very quick. And we also, some of that marketplace content remains in the game to this day, because it was perfectly good content and there's no point reinventing the wheel. So yeah, keep your team lean, don't unnecessarily add people, and try to take shortcuts where you can. 2, use Unreal Engine. When I started out with turning my mod into a standalone game, I had to make a decision about which engine I was going to use, and so I tried Unity, CryEngine, and Unreal. And out of all of them, I really prefer Unreal for a bunch of reasons. It's an excellent, extremely versatile engine, capable of doing pretty much anything we could think of. Even really obscure stuff that we'd never seen before. So, for example, in the Forgotten City, there's a mechanic where you've got a golden bow that can turn people into gold. So you shoot them, and a sort of a layer of gold creeps over their skin, as though it's sort of spreading like molten gold. And whatever animation they were doing slowly comes to a stop, and they turn into a golden statue. And then at a certain point, if they're even slightly off balance, they'll just kind of tip over and clank onto the ground. So that's a level of sophistication in terms of materials and physics that really surprised me. But yeah, the point is that you can pretty much do whatever you want with it, and it's really, really cool. It's super easy to make beautiful stuff. Other engines are capable of producing beautiful scenery, but Unreal makes it very, very easy for you. It has an extremely reasonable fee structure. And it's in effect free unless your game's a runaway success. So, I think the last time I checked, you don't pay any royalties unless your project generates about $1 million in royalties. So if you're working on an indie project, you're probably laughing. And even if your game does become a runaway success, then, a small amount of royalties to Epic is the least of your worries. The other benefit is that using Unreal Engine makes you eligible for Unreal Mega Grants of up to $500,000 US of free money, no strings attached. I was fortunate enough to get one of these grants from Epic, and I'm very, very grateful, because it essentially, again, it allowed us to continue the project, and without it, there's a very good chance that we would have been dead in the water. So it helped us immensely, and and you'd be surprised at how many studios get these grants. So it certainly makes it very attractive from my perspective. And finally, using Unreal will help you to skill up so that you can get a job in a pretty massive and growing network of studios using it. There are a bunch of great studios in Australia and New Zealand using it, and I expect my studio will be recruiting in the coming months, and we'll certainly be looking for people with Unreal experience. Point 3, manage your time well. So I'm sorry to say this, but your game is going to take much, much longer than you think. I thought, rather naively, that my game was going to take 2 years, and I thought that because I already had a pretty comprehensive game design in the form of the mod. So I thought all I would need to do is reimagine, rebuild the systems behind the mod. But I ended up essentially overhauling absolutely everything, and it took me 4.5 years. So I would suggest that if you think your project is going to take X years, then it's probably going to take 2X years, and so you should be prepared to allow that much time, and also to make your budget increased accordingly. In that time, you're going to have thousands and thousands and thousands of tasks on your to-do list. There's no getting around that. Games are just absolutely massive projects, and so a really good way to get overwhelmed is by having a whole bunch of different to-do lists and not knowing which task you're going to focus on next. And so it's critically important that you have a single source of truth for your time management. And so I would strongly recommend using Trello or something like Trello. It's essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially a system that looks like a series of vertical columns, and so you can put to-do tasks into each column. And one of the great features of Trello is that it has a companion app on the mobile. So if you wake up in the middle of the night and remember that you had to do something, then you can just punch that task into your phone and go back to sleep. And in the morning, when you sit down on your computer, it'll be there waiting for you. And that is critically important for making sure things don't fall between the cracks. So personally, I set up my columns in Trello into production, team management, commercial, legal, and marketing, because I think in my experience, almost all of the tasks that you do as a game developer fall into one of those 4 categories. And it's also a good way of sort of visualizing what you have to do in any given day, and making sure that you're not getting fixated on production at the expense of, say, marketing, which is a really common trap for game devs, because you can kind of see that there's all these tasks in marketing that you're not doing. I personally color-coded my tasks as a way of sort of identifying which are the time-sensitive ones. Here you can see the orange ones are important, and there's a little red tag that says that it's something that's time-sensitive, and I've just redacted the text for the purposes of this presentation. So yeah, use Trello. You'll be glad you did. Lesson 4, don't engage with trolls. People on social media will tell you that your game is going to flop. They certainly did in my case. They were wrong, of course. But when you are in the thick of it and making the game, you don't know that. But I promise you, it's not a reflection of you or your game. They're saying that to everybody. Some people are just jerks. And one of the best tools that you have at your disposal, which is unfortunately often overlooked, is the ability to not respond. Think of it as stonewalling. And think of it as a power move, and use it often, because it's just not worth your time getting emotionally invested in a discussion with unreasonable strangers on the internet who derive satisfaction from upsetting you. So some YouTube metrics are really useful. So for example, views on your trailers and likes and dislikes ratios, that'll give you a pretty good idea of how things, how communities are responding to your content. But in my experience, nothing useful ever came from reading comments on YouTube. It's like reading the back of a toilet cubicle door, so just don't read them. If you have a budget, you can hire a community manager who's better able to sift through these sorts of comments without taking it personally. But otherwise, you can and you probably should just cancel your YouTube notifications, because it's just not worth reading. And I think the thing to keep in mind is, this is a sort of a bit of a golden rule for me, is never accept criticism from someone you wouldn't have asked for advice. Really worth thinking about. Lesson 5, prioritize Steam wishlists. Now, it's critically important to build Steam wishlists as early as you possibly can for 3 reasons. The first one is, whenever your game is eventually launched, wishlisters will be notified of that, and they'll also be notified when the game goes on sale. 2, publishers compete for games with big wishlist counts, and when you're in early discussions with publishers and other media organisations, they will just ask you directly how many wishlists do you have, and they will form a basis about whether or not your game is valuable to them based on the number of wishlists. That's not always the case, and sometimes they're willing to look at other things as well, but it is something that is front of mind for a lot of people. And 3, Valve will only help you and give you marketing support if you're absolutely killing it with wishlists. So what you want ultimately is called a global IM, and that is the pop-up that you get when your game launches. The pop-up when you get when you load Steam for the first time in a little while, and you've got to click next through all those games. That's called a global IM. You desperately want one of those for your game because it means that the entire world is getting an ad for your game, and a small percentage of those will convert into clicks, and an even smaller percentage will turn into to purchases. But at a massive scale, that's incredible. Money can't buy advertising, so you can't pay for that from Valve, but you can persuade them to give you one of these global IMs. But to do that, you'll need, at the moment, I think it's about 80 to 100,000 wish lists. That was the advice I had last time, but it always changes. It's not written down anywhere, and it seems to be very fluctuating. So it may increase by the time you launch. But yeah, you desperately need to get as many wish lists as you can, and that's why you see a lot of indie studios plugging their game in and asking you to wish list their game. So how to get wish lists, that's the tricky part. In our experience, the biggest spikes we ever had were from participating in showcases, for example, the PC Gaming Show and IGN's Summer of Gaming. We also got some good healthy spikes from Imager posts as well as Reddit posts, but nothing else we did moved the dial very much. So, lesson 6, get a publisher if you can. I say this because I know that some devs are reluctant to embrace publishers, and I know I was one of them. And I think it's because I hated the idea of giving up a substantial chunk of revenue in exchange for whatever it is that publishers did. I didn't really understand what it was in the early days, and so I was a bit reluctant to go down this path. But in the end, I decided to go down that path, and I can tell you, I think it's absolutely worthwhile to get a publisher, provided you can get a reasonable deal. And the key benefit of using a publisher is that they take on a huge amount of the risk. So if you self-publish, then what could happen is that you could spend several years building up a massive opportunity cost because you're not working, and spending a whole bunch of your own money, and then in the end you launch and you don't get the results commercially that you're hoping for, and you've lost a huge amount of money and time, and it could be very uncomfortable. With a publisher, they take on a huge amount of risk, so they'll pay you for your time. And so if the game isn't commercially successful, it's primarily the publisher that loses out and not you. So that is a huge deal. But in addition to that, they can also provide a lot of support in terms of providing you with marketing and PR support, porting and localization, and various other things. So the first rule of finding a publisher is find decent people to work with. You might have heard horror stories about people being exploited by publishers or having negative relationships with them, and that's something you want to avoid, obviously, but that's definitely possible. And the way you do that is just by doing your research. So if you are getting serious about talking to a particular publisher, you should absolutely ask a bunch of devs who've worked with them in the past what their experience has been like. In my experience, that's what I did. I went to every dev who'd worked with my current publisher and asked them about their experience, and it was all positive. So I was pretty comfortable moving forward, and certainly, the vibe that I got from dealing with due diligence was always very positive and quite convivial. But I also researched some other publishers, and I was told unequivocally by devs who've worked with them to run for the hills. So if somebody tells you that, you should probably take it seriously and don't allow yourself to be tempted by the offer of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, because it's just, I wouldn't want to be stuck in development hell with a publisher who wasn't a good fit. Lesson 2. Your rapport may be as important as your pitch. And what I mean by that is getting along with the person that you're pitching to is super important. And I know that because after I landed my deal, the head of the publisher told me as a passing comment that one of the first questions he asks of his talent scout when they come back to a report is, would you like to have a beer with this person? And so the publishers are just as interested in making sure that you're going to be a good fit for them as you are with, and so make sure that you're personable, and that and to that end, it helps if you take some time to sort of understand the person you're meeting with. Don't just sort of treat them as yet another name on a list of people, but actually take your time to do a little bit of research, maybe read their Twitter feed, find out what their interests are, find out what their motivations are, and try to tailor your pitch accordingly. The third point is that you should try to negotiate a good deal. When I was starting out, I had absolutely no idea what a good deal looked like, so I'm going to give you a little bit of information about some sort of common threads and deals that I've seen and heard about from other devs. When I was at GDC, I spoke with a range of devs about the terms that they had, and this seemed to be a pretty sort of common one. The first thing you'll want is a much bigger advance than you think you'll need, because like I said before, this game will take you much longer and cost much more than you were expecting. Ask for more money than you think you'll need. Ask to keep your intellectual property so that you can make sequels and spin-offs and so on with no issues. You probably wouldn't want the publisher to recoup more than 100% of their advance, i.e. once the game has gone on sale, the publisher should be repaid for their advance from the initial chunk of sales revenue, but you wouldn't want them to repay themselves multiple times. Sometimes they'll try that, but you should try to resist if you can. In terms of revenue split after recoup, I think 70-30 is a pretty common and reasonable one. So when I say 70-30, I mean the dev gets 70% and the publisher gets 30%. You'll also want to get their support with marketing, social media, PR, localization, and possibly porting. But just keep in mind that they will want to recoup most of their expenses, so the more they do, the more you can expect they will take of the revenue. So I just want to emphasize that this is one approach. It's definitely not the only approach, but it might be a helpful starting point or benchmark for people who don't have much experience. And if you'd like to know more about pitching to a publisher, I was part of a panel with Sam Ramlew and Andrew James talking about these issues in another GCAP presentation, so check that out. Lesson 7, get advice. As Socrates said, a wise man knows that he knows nothing, and the same applies for game devs. If you are just starting out and you really don't have any idea how little you know, and I certainly didn't. And so what I discovered is that the game industry is vast and labyrinthine, and there are heaps of traps and heaps of opportunities that you probably never even imagined. And so the way to make sure that you're aware of those is to get advice. And what I mean by risks and traps and opportunities is that there are ways of getting additional revenue, for example, Game Pass deals and sub-publishing deals in Asia, and you just wouldn't find out about these things or the ways to get them unless you have information, and it's not written down anywhere a lot of the time, so you just need to talk to people. I found out about a lot of these things just by building relationships with advisors and people who knew or know more than I do. And so, look, I think it's natural to think, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of money on advisors, on professional advisors, because they're expensive. How do I know I'm going to get a good return on investment? Well, there aren't any guarantees, of course, but in my experience, good advisors will save you 10 times more money than they cost. So, for example, advice I got from my commercial advisor, John Cartwright of Game Consulting, made the difference between me landing a publishing deal or not, and it also made the difference between landing good terms or less than good terms. Also, while negotiating my publishing deal, I got advice from my specialist video game lawyer, Cam Rogers, which literally saved me $250,000. So he told me to ask for something I hadn't even thought to ask for and didn't think I'd get, and I got it. I can't talk about the details, but I can say that the takeaway is that essentially his advice had a 5,000% return on investment, so it was definitely worthwhile. My accountant, LDB, also saved me tens of thousands of dollars by being aware of tax benefits that I was entitled to, which I had no idea about because I can't be bothered thinking about tax. It's very, very boring. So, lesson 8. Don't be afraid to ask for help from legends. So I was shocked at how willing extraordinary people were to help with the project, and it's still remarkable. I mean, I think that it happens a lot in the Australian game dev industry because people are very supportive and tight knit, and that's wonderful. But it also extends overseas to some extent as well. So, for example, we had help from the lead animator of Obsidian, Sean Stewart. We jumped on a 2-hour Zoom call with him, and he showed us how to make much better dialogue animations. He didn't have to do that, but he was happy to help, and he told us that essentially we were basically the only people in the world who cared about this exact sort of type of animation in the same way that he did. So he was happy to help. Really nice bloke. The next person was Mike Laidlaw, who was the creative director of BioWare's Dragon Age games. We follow each other on Twitter, and I just asked him by DM whether he'd be willing to test the game for us in the late stages, and he was happy to help, and ended up giving us a full report of feedback, which was just super professional and just at a level of insightfulness that I hadn't seen from any of the other testers. And yeah, he just did it because he's a nice guy and fellow game dev, and just came to help out. I guess he was interested in the game as well, but yeah, it was really awesome. And then we also had help from a historical consultant who has a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford and who teaches at Cambridge, Dr. Philip Matijak. I'd read one of his books, and I thought, I might reach out to him and see if he'd be willing to give us some advice on ancient Roman and Greek history. And yeah, it turns out he's an avid video game fan. He's clocked about 2,000 hours in Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2, and he offered his time at a very, very reasonable hourly rate. And again, he was just delighted to be able to share his incredible knowledge with people who were genuinely interested and who would take it seriously. And in every one of those cases, I thought to myself before I reached out, surely this extraordinary person wouldn't be interested in helping out this obscure indie. But I asked anyway, and they were happy to help. So yeah, my advice is don't be afraid to ask for help from legends. So point 9 is add voice acting. And this might be a little bit controversial for some early stage devs, but in my view, voice acting is really, really important. I know some people just skip it altogether. But I think that it adds a huge amount of interest and nuance and quality to your narrative and to your writing. So I really think that if you're thinking about skimping on voice acting, you should definitely reconsider. And I'm going to try to convince you why. So first of all, it's faster and cheaper than you might think. The Forgotten City has 60,000 words of dialogue, and to cast 27 very, very good actors cost me about $22,000 US. and I also had to spend about 4,000 AUD on mastering, and I spent about 2 months of my time working 80-hour weeks to get it all directed and recorded. Absolutely worth it. In the end, PC Gamer called the voice acting outstanding, and keep in mind that I have no experience as an actor or a director. I just figured it out as I went along. So, one other key thing is that whoever wrote the dialogue should definitely be the person to direct it, because I think if you... I was originally thinking about handing it over to somebody else to sort of cast and direct, but in retrospect that definitely would have been a mistake, because making sure that the actor is delivering the line exactly as it was intended with all the little nuance and subtle touches is what elevates it above just standard voice acting to something special. Look, I'm gonna drill down a little bit into the process that I used, just to sort of give you one possible way of doing it. So first of all, I put out 29 casting calls on a website called Bidalgo, and also voices.com, but I'll focus on Bidalgo because I think it's a bit better. So each casting call has a project outline, a character profile, and 3 sample lines of text for the audition, which hit sort of 3 key emotional notes for that character. So I listened to about 1,500 auditions, some of which I had to stop listening to after about a second. For example, I was auditioning for a character called Georgius, and sometimes you'd get this long list of auditions and you'd have to go through them quickly, and the first line will be, I'm Georgius, or I'm Gregorius, or I'm gorgeous. And when people get the character's name wrong, you can pretty much be assured that you don't need to listen to the rest of that audition. So you can quickly cut through those auditions, and you'll end up with a list of really excellent actors and on your shortlist. It's actually there are so many wonderfully talented actors out there. You'll have a hard time picking between them. Nevertheless, once you've picked one out, you just send an NDA and then a script, and then set up a live directed session with them. In my experience, we needed about four hours to get through a few thousand words of dialogue. That took about sort of 4 to 6 hours. Look, one thing is that working with voice actors is a huge amount of fun. Like it's a really wonderful thing, and they're in it because they love doing it, and it should be a really fun experience. And if it's not, then you might be doing something wrong. So after the recording session, I asked each actor to cut up each line into its own file, which they're all pretty accustomed to doing in my experience. So if they've got, say, 300 lines of dialogue, then you'll end up with 300 files. And when you're listening to them, you should ask them to make a number of different takes. So each file will end up with a few different takes in it. And as you go, you should make a note of your preferred take. And so when you get the files, you should already have a spreadsheet noting your preferred take, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. Send all that to your audio mastering person, and they'll chop it up for you. And that's important as well, because unmastered audio sounds really rough. So the mastering process is something you could do yourself if you had a lot of time, but it's pretty straightforward to outsource it. And so what will happen is that they'll need to trim it down to just the relevant sound. They'll need to remove any sort of background noise and also normalize it so that there aren't any massive peaks or spikes of volume. You should get your audio back, and then you can just drop it into the game. You should try to set up your game so that you can import your audio in bulk, so that process doesn't become tedious, and you can just grab the files, drop them into the game, and all of a sudden you've got your characters are talking. We also set up a lip sync generation plugin so that we could generate lip sync in bulk, so that we, for our 60,000 words of dialogue, we pretty much just had to click a button and it generated all the lip sync animations. That was expensive software to license, but you may not necessarily need to do that if you're not doing lip sync. So yeah, like I said, the outcome was really good. The feedback we've had about our voice acting was excellent, and it was, like I said, it wasn't expensive. It wasn't overly difficult. It's yeah, and yeah, I'm very, very glad I did it, and I wouldn't do it any other way. Some people will tell you that you need to get actors in a studio. That's absolutely not correct, especially during the pandemic. If you want access to a huge number of actors who've got their own home studios, then you can absolutely do that, and there's no need to bring people into a central studio location. Yeah, the other thing to note is that we were pretty pleased with the people we cast as well. So I just cast on merit entirely, but it turned out that the actors I cast had experience working in the Netflix Witcher TV series, Dragon Age, BB sitcoms like The IT Crowd and The Thick of It, and yeah, good actors, unless they're super famous, are generally pretty reasonably priced. Yeah, so have a think about that, and I hope to see many more indie games in Australia using voice acting. So, lesson 10 is commission mock reviews. If you're not familiar with mock reviews, it's essentially where you pay members of the press to write a private review of your game before launch. They tend to be maybe double the length of a typical review, because the person's being paid essentially as a consultant to give their opinion about the game. So we hired, my publisher hired 2 reviewers to review the game in this way, and we scored a 60 and an 80. So our average was 70, and yeah, look, the feedback was really super valuable, and we went through it with a fine-tooth comb and implemented about 25 changes as a direct result of their feedback, which I think massively improved the game. And everybody else thought that as well, because in the end, the weighted average on Metacritic is 85, meaning our average review score jumped 15 percentage points from this exercise alone. So for $4,000 US, it's just a no-brainer. Best investment we ever made. This is the end of the slideshow, and here is a shameless plug. The Forgotten City, it was very well received and is currently available on PC, on Steam, Epic and GOG, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PS4, PS5 and Switch. I hope you found something of value in this presentation.